are two main approaches that we're going to be talking about, which is models which use accounting data to predict probability of default or predict rating. So it can be one or the other. But the methodology that we are using in both cases is just one, which is the probit or the binary choice models. So binary choice models are saying that your left-hand side variable, what you're trying to predict, is a 1 or 0. It's basically two values, and that's the only thing. So it's not like your nice normal distribution, right? So you have these law of the law of large numbers, the CLS, none of that technically applies when your binary variable is going to be just 1 or 0. Sorry, when your dependent variable is 1 or 0. The second is models which use stock prices to arrive at probability of default. And I think that the emphasis is that here we talked about these are structural models. This is the Merton model. This is the more empirical or the accounting data model. So same P that we are trying to get a handle of, but we are trying to use both different data as well as different approach. So these remain to be the dominant approaches. So part A, estimating P using binary choice models and accounting data. So what is the default, right? We think that the default of a company actually tells you something about the health of the company. A company that is sick, that is not internally well functioning, is supposed to be sick, and that is the one that's likely to default. Okay, so that's why we make the link between what is happening inside the company versus the outcome, which is the binary of one or the other. So we say that default actually depends upon financial health, and we will denote financial health by some summary variable which is called ZI star, right? And I is the company and ZI star is the health of that company. If ZI star is less than or equal to 0, the firm is going to default on the loan. Okay? So if the health of the company, so remember that I'm moving away from the entire language of VT and D and E. I'm saying that there's something about the company that makes it sick. And that something is about the innards of the company, the accounting data about the company. It captures something which is called financial health, which we do not observe. Okay? So it's like saying, somebody was talking to me about public health. It's like saying that there's this entire human system. There are many pieces that make us. And we really don't know whether I'm going to have a heart attack in the next 1 hour or not. Okay? So there can be measures that you put. You can be checking my BP, my temperature, whatever, right? So you can put all of these measures. But the question is, what has to move such that I'm going to have a heart attack in the next 1 hour? And that's like a probability of default. I drop dead, and because something is going inside. Question is, what is it that you can measure about me, and in what combination do you put it together such that you can see that the probability of my dropping dead in the next 1 hour goes up versus down? And that's exactly the same problem that we are trying in this case. So through the balance sheet, the annual report, the profit and loss statements of a company, it's effectively exactly like you're putting all kinds of measurement units on me. Right? So you will get these measures coming out about what are the assets, what are the profits, what are the revenues, what are the costs, what are the taxes being paid. All of these things are pieces that you're constantly getting out about the same firm. Okay? Who are the people who are running it? What is the kind of corporate governance standards? All of that is captured into one intangible called ZI star, but that can never be observed. Okay? The only thing that you can observe is something that makes up ZI star, presumably, and then the outcome, which is default versus not. So here's where I say that ZI star is equal to, and here I'm forcing a linear function on it, right? It need not be linear, but it's old mathematics and old statistics, and therefore ZI star is supposed to be a linear combination of a bunch of observed measures about the company. And then of course we put our standard error saying that there is a bunch of stuff that I do not observe. Okay? So there is something about the financial health that I can capture by things that are measured and something that I cannot. All I know is that this, unfortunately, the ZI itself cannot be seen. It cannot be measured. What can be measured is default versus not. This is a real value. This is a real numbered value. This is a binary value. The question is, how can we combine all of this together to make a model such that we take the inputs, the x's are things that are the measurements that I can observe. Zi I cannot observe, but Zi is what triggers 0 versus 1. Okay? So I take out the middle person and I say, can I figure out a methodology where I can look at the binary and use the inputs use to come up with a statement of what is the probability of default. So using data on default history, that is that I observe companies that have actually defaulted. At the time of their default, I have observed the X's. Now that's critical to remember, right? Because if you look at the company when it was not, the company may have defaulted in 2017, but you only have information about the company in 2013 onwards or backwards. So you don't have any information about the company from 2013 to 2017, pointless. Because if it defaulted in 2017, you need to know what was the information about the company in 2017. This is the same thing that a doctor tells you about heart attack patients. The moment the heart attack happens, you need to get as quickly as possible to the hospital, because understanding the parameters and measures of the body at that time is critical. The body will stabilize if the person lives. It's pointless when the person dies. So if you want to be able to say something about the health of the person, if the person is to live, you need to be able to measure all the parameters. So you may think that you've got lots of data, but as long as there is lack of clarity on the default event, when did that happen, and the actual picture about the company at the time that it happened, then we will always be coming up with less robust linkages between the firm's balance sheet, that is the X's that we can observe about the firm, and the health of the firm. Okay? Because the link is always this, that we want to come up with some understanding of what ZI star is. So you need default history and you need data, and they need to be contemporaneous. So they need to be at the same time. So it's actually quite a lot more difficult than it appears. Modeling. So when you set up an estimation to figure out what is the alpha that you need to put on the X's to be able to capture the ZI star, which is revealed through a binary of 1 or 0, what is the universe of companies that I should put together, right? What's a useful set? What time period is used in estimating the model? What is the definition? What are the variables that I should use? And then which model should I select, right? So these are the things that we will just go through to understand how it is that we think about the modeling exercise of figuring out what variables are important to predict financial health. Okay, so which universe of firms should I be looking at? So the models of default probability differ across company statistics. So for instance, if you had to come up with a statement about how to look at the balance sheet of a manufacturing firm compared to a bank, that's a financial firm, you would look at very different things, because the way that you interpret a profit and loss or an asset and liability statement for a bank compared with a manufacturing firm is different. Okay? So the other differentiation that people usually find when they look at models of accounting data for models of probability of default is if you're a company compared with a public company, which is you're a company that is listed on the exchange versus you are just a registered company, you are held privately by individuals. Okay? There's another way that we can think about public versus private, which is it is owned by a majority by the government of India. Those are public sector companies versus non-public sector companies. And the kind of probability of default models that you will have for. So very often when you put together the companies to come up with a model, which is this model, right? This is what you want to try. You need to be cognizant that the X's that you use, relationships within the X's and the Z's that you will find will be different for different kinds of companies. Okay? Now once again, because this has no structural theory driving it, it has all been discovered by empirics itself. Right? So people have looked at the data, looked at the patterns, and they've said that broadly speaking, this is the way it works. Okay, so most of the literature that is established in this space is actually by credit rating agencies, who are the people who are supposed to be looking at information about the company and putting out a credit rating about the firms that the banks will use. Okay, so and most of the times, at least under the time of 2000, 2010, this was all very precious and guarded. You would never see the model of the credit rating agencies. In fact, even today, if you were to go to CRISIL and say, give me, I'll tell you. You can do it. I'll tell you what the model is that they use. Okay. So number one, you need to recognize that different models will probably show up for different types of companies. Some types of information are not available for some kinds of companies, right? So for instance, publicly listed companies have to disclose a lot more as compared with private companies. So if you're privately held, you need not tell so much about yourself to the rest of the world, whereas listed companies have to say a lot more. So the disclosure will be different. The behavior of ratios themselves are, as I said, the leverage for manufacturing firms and the leverage for banks are very different. Leverage, by the way, stands for how much debt you can take to how much equity you've put together. Remember, so you have a certain, every firm starts with some amount of equity and some amount of debt. Traditionally, financial companies, that is banks, have had at least twice the amount of debt for the same given amount of equity as compared with manufacturing firms. That's just the nature of the business, nothing to get alarmed at. Although in today's world, given the way that banks have been defaulting like crazy and building up bad assets, perhaps we should force that manufacturing companies and banks should have the same leverage. And as I said, this comes to the point that was just raised. Just because a firm has not defaulted just now does not mean that it's healthy. Right? So that is the problem. You cannot take old data to discover or talk about today's firms on default. Our objective in this entire exercise, if we want to understand what drives, what about the X drives default, the perfect would be like a lab experiment. Right? What do you do in a lab when you want to figure out how effective a medicine is? I am told that the best labs in the world take clone rats. Right? They are actual clones. So there is no genetic difference between the two of them. One of them gets the injection, the other does not. And then they observe the two. Clearly in the real economy or in the real world, we can't clone firms and run these little experiments on them. What we try to do instead is to try to set it up so that we match companies to whatever extent that we can. So pick two firms which are in the same industry. So let's say they are both steel companies. They tend to have the same size, right? The same amount of equity capital is there. Maybe the same number of factories, the same number of employees. But one of them has been registered as defaulted and the other has not. Now you can come to me and say, okay, but I cannot find a match for some of the companies that have defaulted. Okay? My suggestion is that if you cannot find a decent match for a company that has defaulted, do not about the defaulted company. Okay, because the only way we can, am I speaking too loud? The only way that you can figure out how it is that X explains health is if you have two firms who have similar looking X's, one of them have defaulted and the other has not. Then you can find out how it is that the particular variables influence the default of one company versus the other. Of course, it's going to be the case that for the firms that have defaulted, their X's will tend to be slightly different. Okay? So that's the whole point, which comes back to your question, right? That I have to pick up companies that are defaulted and not defaulted and the information at the same time. So what I'm trying to do is construct a lab experiment with as many cloned rats as possible. In one bucket are the firms that look alike the firms in the second bucket, except that in one bucket they've defaulted, the second bucket they haven't.
One more question. I don't understand
What I would give is don't use the company. I agree, right? So it's a hard call, because these days what we think is, what we've been brought up to believe is that the more the data, the better. And it's always true. The larger the sample size, the larger the confidence with which you can say something. The problem is that if you have too much variation in one set versus the other, and you will see this is true for all credit risk problems. Why? Because you saw the numbers that I showed you for how many defaulted firms there are versus non-defaulted firms there are. Right? The probability of default for India in between the years 1994 to 99 was 0.45%. It's a very small fraction of firms actually defaulted. So the amount of information that's available for the non-defaulted firms is much larger as compared with the information that's available for defaulted firms. Now if you mush the whole thing together and you put it into a regression exercise, whose information is going to dominate? Clearly the non-defaulted ones. Right? Unless there is big differences in the X's of the defaulted firms that it shows up and loudly stands and says, I can see that X is important because it's such a big change. Okay? So that's a hypothesis that you're postulating, but I agree with the statement that we really need to see the balance sheet information of a company. It is vast, okay? It's not simply linear things. It's not like you can see one asset number and one liability number. There are multiple disclosures where there are independent sources through which you can say that if the asset number unit, subunit over here says X, I can check it from sheet A, sheet B, sheet C, sheet D, and they all need to be consistent. I agree with you, there's no way to completely capture all information that you can capture everything, right? Because then shareholders should be seeing that information. There's a lot of complex information, and very often it's like you're signing a fixed deposit account opening, right? Have you read every piece? Do you ever? So the amount of information in a balance sheet is tremendous. Perhaps that's why when we write these models, as I said, one of the clear problems with the model that I put up is that it's a linear model. Who says anything is linear in a company, right? We don't even start in this exercise to go through the non-linearity of existing small subsets of X's. We should. We've never tried it because the world was set up in such a way that the computation and the programs were such that you were forced, almost coerced, to do linear models as compared with non-linear models. It's only today that you have the computation that's cheap enough and the access to software and estimation programs that is rich enough that you can technically try anything, right? What is a neural network? Neural network is just taking these 1-0 models with 1,000,000 X's and putting it through and say, create a node that might only be true for one observation, but it's there, right? So linearity, all of this stuff is very simplistic, but it's a useful guide for us to think about what it is that we are trying. We are trying to figure out something in the very large amount of information that you can get from a balance sheet to be able to say, I look at this balance sheet. I don't know whether it's default versus non-default. I know the model. I look at this balance sheet and I look at this balance sheet, and I'm able to differentiate a firm that is sick versus a firm that's healthy. That's the objective. Now what Mr. Altman, the first guy who did this, was to say exactly this. There are many more non-defaulted firms than defaulted firms. Plus, I don't know whether all the non-defaulted firms as of right now are actually sick or moving towards default, or they're actually healthy. So what I should try to do is try to pick up these pairs as much as possible. And if I have only 500 defaulted companies, I will try as much as possible to figure out who are the non-defaulted firms, 500 in number, who match these guys. I will not take the entire information data set of the non-defaulted companies because it becomes problematic unless the X's are so different for the defaulting companies.
So one of the safeguards can be that apart from taking these clones that we're talking about, I also
We like calling them matched
observations. The data years which I have are also
absolutely critical. It has to be critical. It has to be the case, right? So if a firm has been, so I have data from 1990 for firms in India and all the way up to 2017, okay? If I find that there's a firm that is declared default in 2017, each matched company will be picked, its data will be picked as of 2017. So if I'm matching a company, so there's a defaulted company that did a default in 2017, okay? Each matched company information will be picked from 2017 only. I won't look at 2019 to pick the 2017 information.
My concern was that both the companies will have it from 1990. It can't be that one starts, so these matched.
It doesn't matter. So all I care about is that for a defaulted company in that year, I must find a match company with information as of that year. I don't care that it's got 10 years of history, years of history. Technically not. Unless I think that age of a firm is important to explain sickness. Okay, but everyone gets the approach. when I create the design matrix to estimate these models, it's not going to be the case that I will necessarily use everything. Similarly, when you think about the sample time period, it is important that the random sample contains some minimum number of defaults and that it should be spread over a sufficient time period, because if I don't have a very large period, then I can't necessarily do nice in-sample, out-sample selection, right? So, India especially, because we have such short time series for defaults, out of time validation is difficult, but we can still do in-sample where it's contemporaneous. So if I have it for a year, I can take some data which is both defaulted and non-defaulted forms. That becomes my in-sample, and in my out-sample I should have some defaulted and non-defaulted forms. Okay, that's the way that I would construct the data for the estimation and the validation. Definition of default, we talked about this a little bit, so I'm not going to go into it in detail. As I said, the big thing that has changed in India since the previous, before 2016, is that there's a new law. We can see a clear definition of default. Before that, you never really knew when it was that a company defaulted, because the system was such that a company could have defaulted for 5 years before, and then you would find out very late. Okay, so very often we would have to look at experts to tell us what the default date was. Now this is where I think that the new matter is in this lecture, which is what is that you will use from the balance sheet. Okay, so here what we are trying to do is we are going to club it into certain kinds of information. As I said, the information from the balance sheet is immense. Okay, there are lots and lots of information. In addition, you can do things like bring out of the firm factors like macroeconomics, industry's health, all of that stuff. Political economy, interest rates, everything can come into the picture as extra ways to explain the financial health of the firm. So what are the 4 things that we categorized over here? That is, for the IIT firm, you have firm characteristics, which is the balance sheet. You have measures like coverage, liquidity, dividend, group affiliation. All of this is information from the balance sheet. It tells you something about who the company is. For instance, group affiliation is, are you a Tata company or not? Okay, so that could be one kind of group affiliation. X2I is firm characteristics that come from the market. So this is one piece of information that comes from the balance sheet. This is one kind of information that comes from the market. So market capitalization, what is the today's value of the equity of your company? You can use, or these models have used. X3 is loan characteristics. It's important, right? Because we are trying prediction. So then we look at what kind of loan characteristics, size of loan, what is the collateral, who's the guarantor, how many banks have you got that has given you a loan. All of that information goes into X3. And X4 are the outside of the firm characteristics like industry characteristics and macro economics. Now, Subrata and I were doing our exercise in 2000. I think we started off with a number of variables which were 75 in number. Okay, so we looked at 75 ratios from the entire balance sheet. At that time, the most popularly used model for probability of default for any company anywhere in the world was the Altman Z-score model. Okay, that's a 1955 model. That model had how many variables? Right? So the thing is, I mean, there was a model, it seemed to be working. Why did we go and say, look at 75? Oh, because we thought, India, it has to be different. Let's take a look. We're sitting in IGIDR. It's not that difficult to get the data, to run the computers. So we ran. Guess how many we ended up with? 6. So the thing is, though, I guess the cautionary story in this tale in this story is, you will often have access to a very large amount of data, especially when you're not guided by theory, right? So when there's no theoretical framework, you look at the data and say, let's try everything. And you can today. Today, you will try 1,500, right? You won't try 72 because we were scared to try 1,500. We didn't have that much compute facility at IGIDR, right? So the thing is that today you have tons of variables, and you need to come up with some heuristic or some statistical methods to whittle down and pull the core out. Okay, so what I think Mr. Altman tried was to say, I think he had all of 56 companies that had defaulted. He matched it with another 56 that were not defaulted, and what he effectively did was gave all the X's, and he said, right, so is there a PCA on the defaulted set and the non-defaulted set where you can find some difference, right? But things like discriminant analysis, principal component analysis are a very good way to figure out whether there are differences between two binary sets that can explain why it is in one set versus the other. Today, of course, you've got, as I said, the data science chaps have come up with all kinds of black boxes which help you to identify which variable might be important, as long as you can define clearly what your end objective is. Okay, in the, or the probability of default problem, it's very easy, right? As long as you have a clear default, you can, that's what I'm trying to predict. You can put the kitchen sink, sun spots, everything into the box, and out will come some model that you don't know what the model is all about, but it's predicting decently well. What for is it useful to think about the variables as levels or changes, right? Because we are trying to see how the sickness of the company is evolving over time. So in that case, should we be looking at percentage changes of the ratios as compared with the levels itself is something that we tried. I think that in the end we figured that standardized levels were the best thing to do. Because Subrata does a lot of work in corporate governance, he also put in variables about how is the audit quality, the accounting practices, that stuff to standardize variables. And after all that, we came up with. Okay, so these are the ratios that are. You can read it on the slide. There are others which are industry, macroeconomic, and management quality. Accounting indicators are short-term solvency, or what I call liquidity ratio. There's something called turnover ratio, which is how frequently you can keep the goods in your warehouse, how frequently you do turnover. Profitability ratios, which is things like how much profits have you made based on the assets that you employed, or how much sales that you've had. So basically all of this is information about a company. And is there something about all of these numbers that can tell you that one company is sick versus not? These are not things that we can financial health. In emerging markets, our thought was, because we are an emerging market, because we don't have very good accounting standards, perhaps there are other things that can help explain. Here is the estimation. So what do you use? Do you use a simple regression? Do you use an MLE? Do you use GMM? Because it's a binary choice model, the Probit model that you talked about yesterday is something that was used. There is no standard model. They all have to be modeled. For different, if you do this, your prediction will be better. The question that we've often asked is, which better will it be? And in some cases, it turns out to be very different. So manufacturing versus financial companies, big differences in the models that are used. Public versus private, not so big. Okay? Some models, instead of looking at the actual default, that I've gone to default versus not, look at proxies. So did you have a credit rating change in this year? Okay, because we didn't have any default data, we looked at credit rating as a change. There are other kinds of proxies you can use. What is the advantage of a proxy as compared with the actual default? Because you can apply that proxy to all companies. Default, very few actually happen. Ratings as the predicted value as compared with default. Why is this important? Personally, I think it's not. It's just that, once again, usually firms have credit ratings. Okay, default is more difficult to observe. So sometimes it's just useful to say, can I model the credit rating? But of course, can only. This one I think I'll skip because that I've covered here. Okay. Model selection. How to do model selection? We chose our model based on the log likelihood value. So let's assume that we have a baby data set with 20 firms, and they are very unimaginatively named A to T. A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, K, L, M, N, O, P, Q, R, S, T. we observe that 4 of them have defaulted, right? So it's B, J, M, and N out of the set of 20 that have defaulted. Okay? We have 2 candidate models, M1 and M2, and we have their probability of their output, which is the probability of default for each of these firms. And this is what the models have given. So what I have here is decreasing order of probability of default, okay? And that's M1's prediction. So the worst guy is B, right. Okay. But the second one, according to model M1, is T, but it's S for M2. So remember that each of these models, think about your probit output. Probit output will be some probability of default number sitting between 0 and 1. What I've done is I've taken the output of these 2 models, just ranked them, and then indexed it to the company itself. So you're seeing which of the companies have been ranked by these models as having the worst or the highest probability of default. So by the time you come down to this, it seems to be exactly on track, correct? So all the good guys get ranked quite nicely by this company. The worst guy probably gets ranked correctly by both companies, by both models, but in between there is some difference. The question is, which model do you pick, M1 or M2? Where?
Sample M1 3, M1 3, and it skipped to 0.12 M2.
That's correct. Now which one do you choose? Do you choose model M or model M1 or model M2?
Model M2.
Well, so you're guessing, I know. Let me show you the power curve. Of default for be over here. Okay. So if I look at the 45-degree line, all I'm saying that you capture the first 20% of the sample in terms of ordered by default. On the y-axis, it's just saying that it's exactly the same, that it's 20% of the defaulted firms that are captured by the model. Okay, so it's a 1:1 mapping. That cannot be a sensible model. It's like saying I toss a coin and I say that if it comes head, that company is going to be bankrupt. If it comes tail, the company is not going to be bankrupted. The company is bankrupted or not. Okay, so this 45-degree line is just a 50% or a coin toss. This is the line which is the best model because it says I've ordered the firms by decreasing probability. So by the time I go to 20%, if the number of firms in my sample, 20% of on the y-axis, it's captured all 20%. Okay, so this is the worst model. This is the best model. Now our models M1 and M2 sit in between. So it's not as bad as the worst model. It's not as good as the best model. So for the first observation, both our models are sitting 1:1. Remember, it got the B. So both of them got it. But by the time it comes to the second one, model M1 has got one more observation. Model M2 has not. Okay. When it comes to the third point, model M1 has got 3 out of our 4 observations, where model M2 has not. Right. So model M2 is dragging over here, whereas model M1 has got a leap up to this point. Okay. So both of them got the first one. Then they both dragged. But on the third one, model M1 got the right one, model M2 didn't. So it went up to a higher level of capturing the fraction of the defaulted firms that have actually defaulted. So what are we looking for over here? Looking for a curve with the definition of the x and the y axis closer to the best model and further away from the 45-degree line. So if you, I don't know which model you said was a better model, but in the M2 is the worst model. M1 is the better model because it's capturing the defaulted firms faster compared with the M2. Okay, so as we pile up the firms that are the higher probability of default numbers, M1 is capturing more of it faster as compared with M2. Okay? Sleep on it, right? I agree that this is something that you have to read, absorb. Sometimes it's just there. I do. I think that when things really suck, I think we all will stand up and do some cool things. And I don't think it will take 50 years. I think that he's underestimating it like crazy, because even the Second World War didn't take 50 years. And I think we are much more sensible people now. And we have to grit our teeth, and we have to do credit risk models, and we have to make sure that the basic instinct of human beings have freedom to work, which is what I think markets do in a very strange way. And my challenge has always been to say, irrespective of regulations, irrespective of laws, how does one make the voice of the people come out? And I think that's what markets do. So I hate this, but I think we should go back to credit risk modeling, because when finance speaks in a true voice, it's actually something that reflects people in a core way, which is why that the next time people ask you, are you involved in financial markets? Please put your hand up, because we all are, right? We are contributing by putting savings into deposits. People get to use it. We should try to figure out ways in which people who are using it use it sensibly. So, viva la markets. Let's get back to credit. Is that okay? Is that okay? Cool. I may be choked for a little while, but hopefully you're able to see the slides and we can read it. One should never, ever, ever stop thinking rationally and calmly, because that's the only way forward. Even when we have to strategize, think rationally. Researchers are the most important things that we can build in this country, so I have a lot of faith in you guys. Please do good work and learn how to do good model validation. And let's monitor, let's measure, let's make sure that we're doing the right things with evidence, as compared with out of some sense that we have got it logically right. Sometimes yield curves do go upside down, but very often if we look closely enough, there is a good reason for it. Okay? Can we get back to the slide? Or should we just say forget about it? I'm waiting for your vote now. And you find the model moves away from the 45-degree line and hugs the outer edge. So how do you interpret the power curve? The 45-degree line is the line of zero prediction. So the model is just saying 50%, like it's a time cost model. The steep line close to the y-axis is a line of perfect prediction, because by the time you come to the probability of default of the full sample, you've got all the firms predicted by the model as defaulted. The closer the model's power curve is to the 45-degree line, the worse the model is. So one of the things that we can do is that observe that the line is a graphical picture, correct? What we can do is one more thing, okay, and this is where calculus comes into the picture. You can actually capture the area under the curve, right? So suppose you want to come up with one single quantitative measure that tells you how the model is performing. What would you do? You look at the area between this curve and the 45-degree line, and the closer that area is to 1, the better is your model prediction. So this is what is called the accuracy ratio. The curve is a graphical picture. As I said, visually it's very appealing. And I'll show you the output of the power curve for the model that Subrata and I estimated, and you can see how wonderful the power curve is. And the second is that if you do not have the ability to show a curve, you calculate a number out of the same curve, which is the area under the curve. So there you're looking for a number which is closer to 100%. Okay. So these are the references for the core papers that started this entire accounting data modeling framework. As I said, Altman is actually 68, and he's got another paper in 95 which is about emerging markets. What you may want to do is actually, if you ever get interested in this field, is there are 2 websites which focus very closely on new research for probability of default. One is called defaultrisk.com. The other one is actually a very interesting venture that was started in Singapore. One of the professors there said that credit rating agencies have got a monopoly on the information that people are using to come up with a probability of default estimate. He said, I want to crowdsource this, right? So what he has done is, he's created a repository of information about firms and their defaults. And he says that anyone who's a researcher who is interested in building a model using this data can come and register and use the data. Okay? So he doesn't put any cost on it, there's no fee, but you can just register yourself. Usually when you are a researcher, he says the cost of access of the data is free, but he puts it out there, and then all the models that come out around it is something that you can publish on this website. So I urge you, if you have an interest in credit risk, to take a look at these two websites and see whether this engages you and interests you. And perhaps even though that all of you are probably already in a thesis right now, if one day when you become faculty or a person who's a researcher at a think tank, and one day you see that the credit risk problem is a big one, you can start using some of these data sets to test out models. So my moment of glory. One example of an EP model, that's the expected probability of default model. Subrato Sarkar and me in 2002 used this data to come up with an alternative to the Altman model for India. Okay? As I said, Altman had 5 ratios. Out of our 75 ratios that we tested, we found the 5 ratios, same 5 ratios mattered. But we also found that if you put an industry dummy, so you know it matters which industry you're in, if you put that information into the model, whether you're part of a Indian business house or a foreign business house or you're a standalone Indian model, that mattered to be able to predict the probability of default. And we had a threshold probability variable which kept changing through the years. So it's sort of like saying that when you take my temperature, I may not be at the optimal temperature, I might be a little high, but that might be just because I'm sitting in Patna where the outside temperature is 35 degrees. Okay? So there's a certain highness or a lowness of the probability of default in the overall economy, and that's another number that is measured in this model. So there were some innovations in the model. We did find that there were some things that were interesting and important about emerging markets. And I think that that's what the model used. Note the sample size. We weren't very smart about saying just use matched firms. We took the whole lot. So there were 384 default episodes, and there were 17 or 18,000 non-default episodes. There were 4 years of data, and we kept 3 years out of sample to test the model. So let me explain the curves. This is a 45-degree line. Can you see all the curves? There's a 45-degree line which is no prediction. The next line is the Altman Z-score model. As I said, the Z-score model is something that a lot of countries have used, variables as well as weights. Okay? So that's the first model. We took the Z-score model, the Altman Z-score model, and re-estimated weights using our data. That's the second model. And you can see that when you re-estimate the weights using our Indian data, we find that there is an improvement in the model. So this is Altman core, weights plus variables. This is Altman variables, but our weights. Okay? And you see that the curve has pushed out. Remember, I said that what we're looking for is a curve that pushes closer and closer to the line of perfect prediction. Note how here the line is very steep because the ratio is 784 out of 18,000. So it goes to the top very quickly. Moody's, which was another firm before it got, I think, merged with some other firm. It's a credit rating agency. They also used to publish their model. We re-estimated the Moody's variables using our data, and we found that that actually predicted a lot better compared with the Altman model. But what is the top curve is our model, which is the 5 variables plus the industry dummies plus the Indian business house dummies plus the threshold variable. And that's one which gave the best performance by way of highest accuracy ratio, and it was also the closest to the curve. Now you can sit and argue that, look, internationally everyone is using the Moody's curve. I don't have to explain the Subrato Sarkar Susan Thomas curve. why don't I just use this? But there is a benefit, right? Because you are capturing a larger amount of the defaulted data faster. But this is the power of using the curves. So you don't have to be showing small things. You can have many firms, defaulted firms, and you can actually see which firm, which model is doing better. So every model can actually be a power curve on this line. Deep breath. We're moving away from the world of accounting data. This is going to become a little more cool, a little more technical. It is my favorite model, actually. I don't like the Altman-Zesco model because, like most of you, I don't like balance sheets. I think that they can lie. But stock market prices lie less. Okay. So what is this idea? Merton in 74 used what is called the option pricing theory to look at a way of coming up with a real-time estimate for the value of the firm as long as the firm's stock traded in the market. Okay, so have any of you ever had the opportunity to open up the price of a share and looked at it on the exchange? Do you all have phones? Do you all have connectivity? Open up the NSE's exchange. It's called www.nsc-india.com. If you don't have connectivity, share with your partner. Basically, go to the NSE website. Did you all find it? Do you have no cover? Really doesn't matter. Information there that effectively you will be able to see for any company that the prices keep changing. Okay? So that's what leads into what I'm going to be talking about. That remember that in the beginning I said default is all about asking the question, okay? And if you want to be a person who's tracking the credit risk of a company, you're going to be asking this question all the time. And unlike banks who appear to be doing it at the start of giving a loan and never watching it after, today if you are a company that's listed on the exchange, we know today a way to estimate the value of the company in real time using the equity market prices. Okay? So technically, if you think that debt is a number that you owe to people and that remains relatively fixed, that's a balance sheet number, but the value of the company is something that you want to be able to estimate all the time, as long as you have information that's coming from the stock market, where your prices are responding to news and information continuously. What we're going to be talking about next is an estimation methodology to find out the value of the company in real time. Okay? So as long as the exchange is open and there's a price that you can get, you can actually estimate the value of the company. How the entire methodology works, because there's fairly sophisticated mathematics in how we will come up with a solution. Okay? So we will come up with a solution that says the value of the company in real time and the volatility of the value of the company is going to come as a two-equation model in two systems. Sorry, two equations, two unknowns in two equations, that's the system that we are at. Okay? The value of the company and the volatility of the value of the company are the two unknowns, and the equity price and the equity volatility and the debt are three pieces of information. Debt remains constant, so we'll ignore that for right now. But if you have a continuous change in the equity price and the volatility, you will be able to estimate a VT and a sigma of V. Okay. So there's a paper by Merton in 1974 which says that in every firm there's an option payoff. Okay. How many of you have had exposure to options? How many of you know what a call option is?
We have read in undergrad.
You have very sophisticated undergrad. Okay, I will explain. I will just spend 1 minute explaining it, right? Suppose it's the value of something, okay, and you can see the value of that something. What you want to do is fix the price of that good for you, but not to do a transaction today. So think of it this way. You know that your birthday is coming up. Your grandmother is going to give you 50,000 rupees. Okay. At the same time, done? At the same time, you have a niece whose birthday is coming up. It's a 1-year-old niece. And even you have to give some gold to this child. This is India. Some people have had to do this, right? So the thing is, there's money that's coming to you 6 months later. Niece's birthday and the gifting of the gold is also happening, fortunately enough, 6 months later. The problem is that you know how much you're going to get from grandmother. So 50,000 is fixed. The problem is what can happen to the price of gold at that time, because you have to buy the gold, right? Price of gold can change. Right? In these crazy times, maybe the price of gold will go up really sky high because people think of gold as a safe asset, right? So you know 50,000 can buy you the correct amount of gold today, all right? You're getting the money only 6 months later. You're going to buy the gold, take the gold, because you're getting the money only 6 months later, you can only buy the gold 6 months later. What would you like to do? Fix the price today, right? The call option is a financial contract that allows you to do this. No. Futures that says fix the price today, but no matter what happens to the price of gold in the future, you have to deliver the money and take the gold. Call option is a little more interesting. It says that if the price of gold 6 months later is 50,000 or higher, I can come and buy the gold at 50,000. But if the price of gold is 40,000, I don't have to come and pay you 50,000 for it. Okay? Now, of course, there has to be someone who will offer this trade to you. And that person is effectively saying, if the price of gold is 60,000, I'm going to give you that correct amount of gold that we fixed today at 50,000 rupees, 6 months later. If it is 40,000 rupees, you won't come and give me the 50,000 rupees, and that's what I have to live with. Okay, that's fine. The only catch is, unlike a futures contract, where you don't give any money upfront, you just shake hands and walk away. In the case of an options contract, you pay some money upfront. It's a very nominal amount. It's usually less than 8%, 6%. Okay, and the question is, will you do it? Well, never mind. This is the contract. So today you pay a nominal amount to be able to go up to that person and take the gold at this fixed price, no matter what the price is in the market, and you have the right to walk away if the price in the market is cheaper. That's a call option. Merton looked at a firm and said, hey, look, that looks like a firm. Why? Because the debt holders have the right to come to the firm and take the debt at any given point in time. Okay? The equity holders have got all the obligation and not the rights. So Merton says that there is a call option payoff in every firm, and if it's true, then we can actually find the value of the firm by using the option pricing model. Okay, so here's what it is, right? Call option gives the investor the right but not the obligation to buy a share at a predetermined price within a predetermined period of time. For this right, the investor pays C. This is like the premium that you're paying in order to be able to get this price. If the price of the share rises much higher than X during T, then the investor gets to buy the share at X, and if the price drops, the investor has the choice to walk away, and this is what the payoff diagram looks like, right? You will only exercise if the price of the equity goes above the X. So here on the X-axis is the equity price. On the Y-axis is how much is your payoff, that is how much extra money notionally you will get. You will exercise only if the price goes more than X. And if the price goes more than X, the benefit to you for every paisa that it goes up, you are better off because you are only paying X to buy this contract. She gets the C up front. So it's for her, it's like a lottery. There is some probability with which the X will remain below. She gets to keep the C. She doesn't have to give the C back. And she gets the C right now. Right? It's not like she's got to wait for 6 months to get C. Okay? So she's also looking at it as a probability play, which is that perhaps she believes that the probability with which the price will go above X is very low. She knows something about the company. You just care about the company's share, right, and fixing the price. Could be the case that just like in the beginning we had a bond trade that was possible because we had different expectations. This is also possible because we have different expectations about the future. Now what is a firm? The firm is constructed out of debt and equity. Equity shareholders have control over the firm, but debt holders have a promise that they will be paid a fixed amount. Okay? When shareholders cannot pay the debt, they lose control to debt holders, and this is called default. So as long as shareholders can pay the debt, they have the upside, right? So this is like the underlying is called the value of the firm. As long as the value of the firm is above D, shareholders have value. As soon as the value of the firm becomes below D, they lose all value. Okay? And for this, they pay a nominal price. They pay the share price. So what you see is that as the value of the firm increases above debt, there is a payoff for the equity shareholder. If it is below, then she's paid the share price and she's forgotten about it. Okay. So the question is, can we estimate the value of the firm if we get to see what is the call option price of or the equity price? Now, in the previous case, we said, I see the equity price, I need to calculate how much C it is. If C is equal to equity in the second one, I see the equity price, I need to estimate the V. Okay? So the analogy is that in the option pricing world, if equity is the underlying and the call option price is the price, then in this world, the price is the equity and the value of the company is the underlying. So we usually say C is equal to the Black-Scholes formula. Now we'll say we observe the E. That's the C. Now we want to reverse calculate what is the V. Okay, and that's what this entire thing is about. So basic idea, equity is like a call option price on the firm's asset value with debt as the strike. And the firm shareholder have a call option on the firm's assets. So the seminal papers are cited in this. You can take a look and read it. I think the first paper is reasonably simple if you've had some exposure to the option pricing formula. And it's a nice paper to read. So here we are saying that over time, the value of the firm keeps changing. It's a distribution, right? Then depending upon where the debt sits, there is some value to the option versus not. Okay? So that's just a way of showing what the asset value is as compared with what it is that it can be in the future. Operationalizing Merton, what we know is that we can see the equity market capitalization of the firm. We can see the volatility of the equity of the firm. We know the level of debt. What we do not know is the value of the firm, and we do not know the sigma or the volatility of the value of the firm. So we can set up two equations in two unknowns, which is what KMV did. These are the guys, Kielhofer, Merton, Masicek are the chaps, the three academics who made a ton of money by selling their model to the credit rating agency. Debt is assumed to be homogeneous with maturity at time t. The capital structure of the firm is a sum of dt and et. But in this, what is it that we know or we can observe? D is something we can observe. E is something we can observe. What we cannot observe is VA. That's a value of the firm. What Merton did was to say that let's assume that the value of the assets or the value of the firm follows a geometric Brownian motion. In which case, the dynamics is that the value of the firm changes as this equation, right? So there is a dt equation and there's a Wiener process equation, And the sum of these two will tell you how the value of the company changes through time. Okay? So if I use the analogy with the Black-Scholes model, equity E is equal to the call option price, debt is equal to strike, and value of the firm V is equal to the equity price. So these three pieces come from the Black-Scholes model. What we are doing is we are putting our problem as equivalence against the Black-Scholes price. So if the call option price, this is the Black-Scholes call option price. As I said, don't worry about it if you don't know what it is. Only understand that earlier we used to say the Black-Scholes focused on the equity market price, the strike price, to get a call price. Okay? In this case, we know the call price, we know the E. What we want to do is estimate the V and knowing the D. Okay? So there is an Ito formula that says that there is a relationship between the value of assets or the firm, the value of the equity, the sigma of the equity, and the sigma of the value. Okay? So this is the core that is used to solve out for the equations. And these are the two equations that you have to solve. But once you solve all this, you get to see a real-time ticker for the value of the firm. It's a function of the equity price of the firm. Once you see the equity price, you can actually see the value of the firm. Once you have that, because I have a real-time movement of value of the firm, I can actually calculate, continuously calculate what is VA minus D. Okay? Then what I do is, they create something called the distance to default, which is, if the value of the firm is much higher than D, you're very safe. But as the value of the firm comes closer to D, you become closer and closer to distress. So this distance from default or distance to default says that as you're coming closer to D, then you're coming closer and closer to default, which is that your distance to default is coming closer and closer to 0. Okay. And that's what all of this material is about. What are the catches here? It only applies to listed firms because you need to see the equity price. You need to be able to calculate the volatility of the equity price. You need inputs as a time series of market capitalization daily. This is something if you have access to the Provis website, Provis product, you get it, or on the website of any of the exchanges. You need to estimate the volatility of equity, and you get a debt figure which is either annual or quarterly. The output will be you will get the value of the firm as a time series, and you will get the volatility of the value of the firm, and you can calculate the DTD. Okay? So if you wanted to test this on one of the companies that you watch, we have a package that allows you to calculate this entire model and system, and it's available at this, this website. You need to run R, which is the statistical software system, to be able to run it, but it's free. You can get it. So all you need are these data sets. Any company, you can calculate the DTD. There's a lot of research, as I said earlier also, in estimating the value of the sigma of the firm. So what you see over here on the board, let me tell you what it is. On the x-axis is daily data. So this is time in days, running from Jan 2013 all the way up to May 2017. Okay? This is what is called the value of the distance to default. Remember, the closer it is to 0, the closer the company is to default. Now if you look at each of this, and there are 4 levels, types of DTDs that I have calculated depending upon 4 different kinds of volatility models. So you can see that Hindustan Lever has shown DTD pretty much ranging between a small number like 1 or 2. The highest was 20. So it was at one point, the capital that it had was saying that it was a very, very, very safe company, very far away from 0. But in any case today, it's something like a 5 units away from default. Okay, so it's pretty safe. Similarly, the same numbers show up even if you use a different range estimator for volatility. Here you can see that it's around 5 even if you use an implied volatility estimator. And here you can see that the distance to default is 6. I wanted to show you some bank DTDs because banks are the companies that are supposed to be in distress. I wasn't able to get it early enough, but I see that it's just been mailed to me. If you have some interest, please come and take a look at the pictures that I've got. But the thing is that irrespective of which company it is, right? It can be a financial company, it can be a non-financial company. As long as you got listed prices, you can actually find out how the distance to default of a company is moving through time. So here if you look at it, when was Hindustan Lever most in distress? So usually when we think about it, HV, that is historical volatility, is the poorest forecaster for volatility. So we usually ignore this. This is pretty noisy. IV is coming as a volatility forecast from options markets. We tend to like that a lot. And EWMA is what most regulators in the world use. Okay? So note, company is close to default when the DTD is close to 0. So the only time that it looks like Hindustan Lever was ever in distress or close to distress against the Black-Scholes price. So if the call option price, this is the Black-Scholes call option price. As I said, don't worry about it if you don't know what it is. Only understand that earlier we used to say the Black-Scholes focused on the equity market price, the strike price, to get a call price. Okay? In this case, we know the call price. We know the E. What we want to do is estimate the V and knowing the D. Okay? So there is an Ito formula that says that there is a relationship between the value of assets or the firm, the value of the equity, the sigma of the equity, and the sigma of the value. Okay? So this is the core that is used to solve out for the equations. And these are the two equations that you have to solve. But once you solve all this, you get to see a real-time ticker for the value of the firm. It's a function of the equity price of the firm. Once you see the equity price, you can actually see the value of the firm. Once you have that, because I have a real-time movement of value of the firm, I can actually calculate, continuously calculate what is VA minus D. Okay? Then what I do is, they create something called the distance to default, which is, if the value of the firm is much higher than D, you're very safe. But as the value of the firm comes closer to D, you become closer and closer to distress. So this distance from default or distance to default says that as you're coming closer to D, then you're coming closer and closer to default, which is that your distance to default is coming closer and closer to 0. Okay. And that's what all of this material is about. What are the catches here? It only applies to listed firms because you need to see the equity price. You need to be able to calculate the volatility of the equity price. You need inputs as a time series of market capitalization daily. This is something if you have access to the Provis website, Provis product, you get it, or on the website of any of the exchanges. You need to estimate the volatility of equity, and you get a debt figure which is either annual or quarterly. The output will be, you will get the value of the firm as a time series, and you will get the volatility of the value of the firm, and you can calculate the DTD. Okay? So if you wanted to test this on one of the companies that you watch, we have a package that allows you to calculate this entire model and system, and it's available at this, this website. You need to run R, which is the statistical software system, to be able to run it, but it's free. You can get it. So all you need are these data sets. Any company, you can calculate the DTD. There's a lot of research, as I said earlier also, in estimating the value of the sigma of the firm. So what you see over here on the board, let me tell you what it is. On the x-axis is daily data. So this is time in days, running from Jan 2013 all the way up to May 2017. Okay? This is what is called the value of the distance to default. Remember, the closer it is to 0, the closer the company is to default. Now if you look at each of this, and there are 4 levels, types of DTDs that I have calculated depending upon 4 different kinds of volatility models. So you can see that Hindustan Lever has shown DTD pretty much ranging between a small number like 1 or 2. The highest was 20. So it was at one point, the capital that it had was saying that it was a very, very, very safe company, very far away from 0. But in any case today, it's something like a 5 units away from default. Okay, so it's pretty safe. Similarly, the same numbers show up even if you use a different range estimator for volatility. Here you can see that it's around 5 even if you use an implied volatility estimator. And here you can see that the distance to default is 6. I wanted to show you some bank DTDs because banks are the companies that are supposed to be in distress. I wasn't able to get it early enough, but I see that it's just been mailed to me. If you have some interest, please come and take a look at the pictures that I've got. But the thing is that irrespective of which company it is, right? It can be a financial company, it can be a non-financial company. As long as you've got listed prices, you can actually find out how the distance to default of a company is moving through time. So here, if you look at it, when was Hindustan Lever most in distress? So usually when we think about it, HV, that is historical volatility, is the poorest forecaster for volatility. So we usually ignore this. This is pretty noisy. IV is coming as a volatility forecast from options markets. We tend to like that a lot. And EWMA is what most regulators in the world use. Okay? So note, company is close to default when the DTD is close to 0. So the only time that it looks like Hindustan Lever was ever in distress or close to distress in this period, right? Over here, 2013, yeah. Yeah, so no. So it's a very funny thing because it seems to have gone through certain kinds of structural changes, and one thing that you would look for here is to say, because the model sits on the combination of debt and equity, what was the financial structure of HUL during this period? So if there were a lot of changes that were happening, then perhaps at one point it was deleveraged significantly and then they took on more debt, and that's why some of these numbers are changing. Right? So it is sensitive to the volatility of equity, but broadly speaking, the range seems to be between 3 to 6, right? Broadly all the way through. So this is what you can calculate for every company that's listed. And I think this is a new thing that we can see. We can also do some comparatives. This is the similar set of graphs for Mahindra and Mahindra. Which is the more risky company? Correct. So I mean, if you believe the volatility to Mahindra and Mahindra, which is more about tractors and vehicles, Mahindra and Mahindra seems to like sitting in the lower DTD ranges, which is closer to 0 as compared with HUL. So my sense is even though there is much less volatility in Mahindra and Mahindra, the levels of the DTD are closer to 0. So it tends to be a company that appears to be more close to default as compared. Let me not say that. Close to default sounds terrible. It has higher credit risk as compared with HUL.